In 2009, Stewart Butterfield launched a massively multiplayer online game called Glitch. The game had a development budget of approximately $17 million, a team of 45 people, and a design philosophy that was, by any conventional measure, uncommercial. Glitch was collaborative rather than competitive. It had no combat. Its aesthetic was whimsical and dense. Its mechanics were built around cooperation, creativity, and a kind of exploratory slowness that was entirely at odds with the design principles driving the gaming industry's most successful titles at the time. Glitch launched in 2011. It attracted a dedicated user base that loved it with the specificity and intensity that small audience creative products often generate. It did not attract a large user base. It did not generate revenue at the scale required to sustain a 45-person team. In November 2012, Butterfield announced that Glitch was shutting down. The company Tiny Speck had approximately $5 million in remaining cash. Butterfield's investors, who had backed the game and now faced the prospect of a write-off, were given a choice: take the remaining cash back as a partial return, or allow the team to try something else with what was left. Most of them took the money back. A small number agreed to let the team try something else. What the team had built while making Glitch, almost incidentally, as an internal communication tool was a messaging system that they had used to coordinate across the game's distributed development team. The system was fast, searchable, and organized around channels. The team that had used it for 3 years considered it significantly better than email for the kind of work they were doing. The decision to bet the remaining $5 million on that internal tool is the decision this episode is about. Butterfield and the remaining team at Tiny Speck spent the next several months building a version of the internal messaging tool that could be used by companies other than their own. The pivoted product was called Slack. The bet looked bad from almost every conventional angle. Enterprise software was, in 2013, dominated by Microsoft through Outlook, SharePoint, and the broader Office ecosystem, and by a range of established collaboration tools that had existing enterprise sales relationships and compliance certifications. Entering that market from a failed gaming company, with a team that had no enterprise software sales experience, a product that had never been tested outside of their own internal use, and approximately $5 million in development runway, was not what investors would have described as a high-probability proposition. The product launched in August 2013 in a limited invitation-only beta. On day 1, approximately 8,000 users signed up. Within 24 hours, that number had more than doubled. The team that had expected to iterate through a quiet beta period found themselves scaling infrastructure in real time to accommodate a demand curve that none of their projections had modeled. By February 2015, Slack was valued at $2.8 billion. By the time Salesforce acquired the company in 2021, the valuation was $27.7 billion. The $5 million that remained after Glitch's closure, the amount that most investors had declined to continue backing, had produced a $27.7 billion outcome. What the standard version of this success story misses is the specific nature of the insight that drove the pivot. It wasn't that Butterfield saw the future of workplace communication. It was something considerably more modest and considerably more replicable. Have you ever watched something that was built for one purpose turn out to be significantly more valuable for a different one? I want to hear what that looked like from inside it. Leave a comment. The insight was this: the Tiny Speck team had been using their internal messaging tool for 3 years, and they had noticed something specific about how it changed the texture of their work. Conversations that had previously required a meeting were resolved in a thread. Information that had previously lived in someone's email inbox was now searchable by the whole team. Context that had previously been lost when someone left the company was now archived in a channel. These observations were not revolutionary. They were empirical. The team had specific, first-hand evidence that this tool changed how they worked, and they had the intellectual honesty to ask whether the change they had experienced might be replicable for people whose working conditions resembled theirs. This is the thing the standard success narrative obscures. Slack was not built on a vision of the future of work. It was built on an observation about a specific product that a specific team had used daily for 3 years, and that had, demonstrably, made that team's work better. The leap from that observation to a $27.7 billion company required many subsequent decisions about pricing, about the freemium model, about which integrations to prioritize, about how to navigate the Microsoft competitive threat. None of those decisions were obvious, but the initial decision was grounded in something verifiable rather than something projected. The pivot worked not because Butterfield was a visionary. It worked because he was honest about what he actually had evidence for, in a context where the pressure from investors who had written off the game, from a team whose identities were tied to the product that had failed, was to either declare victory retroactively or to pursue the next ambitious idea rather than the modest observation sitting in front of them. If this is the kind of analysis that makes a channel worth subscribing to, the like and the subscription both go to the same place directly to whether more of this gets made. What made the Slack pivot uncomfortable at the time, and what gets compressed in the triumph narrative, was the specific human cost of the glitch shutdown. 45 people had given years of their professional lives to a game they believed in. Glitch had a community users who had built relationships, invested time, and formed genuine attachments to a product that was, by any honest assessment, something unusual and worth making. The closure of Glitch meant the end of that community. The users who loved Glitch did not love Slack. They had not been promised Slack. They had been promised Glitch, and Glitch was gone. Butterfield has spoken in interviews about the decision to close the game with real candor. He has described it as one of the hardest things he'd done professionally. Not because the business logic was complicated, it was straightforward. The game was not going to be financially viable, but because the distance between business logic and human consequence was, in this case, unusually visible. The people who lost access to Glitch were not anonymous customers. They were a community the company had cultivated. They had been told repeatedly that the company cared about what they cared about, and then the company shut down the thing they cared about. This is the part of pivot stories that doesn't make it into the case study. The people who were on the other side of the decision that saved the company. The community that was close to fund the thing that worked. The team members who left because they had joined to make games, not enterprise software, and who didn't want to be part of the company Tiny Speck was becoming. The success of Slack doesn't retroactively resolve those costs. It just means they were worth it, on balance. Which is a different statement from saying they weren't real. The Slack story is often told as a story about pivoting, about the courage to abandon a failing plan and pursue an unexpected opportunity. That framing is accurate but incomplete. What it misses is the specific epistemic condition that made the pivot sound. Butterfield didn't pivot to something new. He pivoted to something he had 3 years of daily evidence for. The difference between that and chasing a new opportunity with equivalent enthusiasm, but no equivalent evidence, is the difference between a pivot and a bet. Most pivots are bets. They're made under pressure, with limited time, by teams that have been wrong about something significant and are searching for the next thing to be right about. The pressure itself distorts the evaluation. The need to recover from a failure produces a specific kind of motivated optimism that looks like insight, but is structurally closer to the narrative override that killed WeWork. The Slack pivot was unusual because the team had specific, first-hand, non-projected evidence for the claim they were making about the product. They hadn't imagined that companies would want better internal communication tools. They had used one. They knew, with specificity, what it changed. The practical thing, when evaluating a pivot under pressure, the question worth asking is not, is this a compelling opportunity? The question is, what do I actually have evidence for as distinct from what I'm projecting? The two feel identical from inside the pressure. They are not identical in terms of what they're worth betting on. The next episode looks at a case where the evidence was real, the analysis was sound, and the outcome was still wrong, because the external factor nobody had modeled arrived at exactly the wrong moment, which is the kind of failure that resists practical lessons, and that turns out to be the most common kind. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical Stoicism.